So I'll just do a brief introduction of our panelists, and then they are in order in the booklet. I'm not sure if they'd like to go in that order, as they are in the booklet. Okay. And then I also will say before I get started, because I might forget, that I'll have little timekeepers here. So I'll sit in the front row, and I'll show you a little time, and it's nearing 10-minute mark and down from there. So of course you have 20 minutes for your presentations. So I'll start with Dr. Carole Boyce-Davies, Professor and Chair, Department of English at Howard University, and a Professor of African Diaspora Literatures and Distinguished Professor of Humane Letters and Professor of Africana Studies and Literatures in English at Cornell University. She's the author of Black Women's Rights, Leadership, and the Circularities of Power, Caribbean Stories, Escape Routes from Twilight Zones, on the internationalization of Caribbean culture, Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, and the classic Black Women Writing and Identity, Migrations of the Subject. In addition to over 100 essays and articles published in major professional journals, Dr. Boyce-Davies has also published 15 critical editions on African diaspora and Caribbean literature and culture. A member of the Scientific Committee for UNESCO Updated General History of Africa, she edited and the Epistemological Forum on Global Blackness for the recently published African Diaspora volume. Please welcome Dr. Davies.
Good morning. It's a joy being here, and thank you, Dr. Leo Zulu. I was fascinated by your name. When I got emails from you, I was like, wow, what a cool name. I like a name like that. Leo Zulu, that sounds really fun. And for organizing this event, and I, listening to Dr. Campbell, I realize now how his role in helping articulate this came together. But what I'm even more excited about is Ruth Nicole Brown, and she does not know why, but you know why, right, Dr. Chile? That I was part of the committee that studied why Michigan State had a PhD program, was awarding a PhD but did not have a department. So that was one of our key recommendations, you remember, and there was a group of faculty, including Dr. Chile, they were ready to walk. They were like, this cannot
We did walk.
Okay, so there was a politics behind it. So it's such a joy to see it activated and to hear you, and I'm so impressed with what you said and the way you framed it in terms of migrations across the United States. We forget about those internal migrations, but also it's the relationships to indigenous peoples, appropriation of resources of the indigenous peoples and so on, and I see you representing all of that, and also knowledgeable from the African continent itself. So thank you for that work. And I had heard about the unabashed Black feminism coming out of the department. I see why. And I recognize you. Nice to meet you. So to this, I actually changed my paper a little bit. There's a PowerPoint somewhere, I believe, if I can have it up. It's called, I changed it to Crossing Colonial Borders, Micere Mugo's Creative Theoretical Assertion. And you'll see why. I was fortunate to visit Nairobi earlier this year, and waiting at the home of a local cultural worker, Dungi actually, who I was just amazingly, just right now, he sent me a text at his house, at the home of his house, in Dungi's house, and he's a cultural worker, musician, and activist in Kenya. Waiting to receive a group that was coming by road from Tanzania. I was struck when a phone call update from the group. The person who was speaking said, quote, "We have crossed the colonial border, so we should be there in another 2 hours," or so, unquote. So in other words, the reality of moving through African countries to see friends and loved ones and sometimes family means crossing colonial borders. It clarified for me even more the still semi-colonial status that I have addressed in a prior discussion. And I was trying to go back to the idea of semi-colony that comes out from Nkrumah and comes out from Lenin as well, ironically, to talk about, and Campbell Brathwaite uses it, to talk about the fact that we still live in kind of semi-colonial status. And that's a whole paper that I can share later if anybody's interested. Micere Mugo then was really clear about this need to cross these borders ideologically, mentally, and physically. As one could see from her own personal and intellectual history of living in exile in Zimbabwe, developing mutual comradeship, which is a really cool term that Cherise Burton-Stelly, young black leftist scholar, uses, but developing mutual comradeship with Amatai Adu in Ghana, and feeling at home, as Horace Campbell indicates, even in Syracuse, particularly if she was able there to build Pan-African community in those locations. And I say this because she was at the center, I know, of upstate New York, recreating a Pan-African community. Micere Mugo was therefore clear about this, as you can see from her work. She was also clear then that these Pan-African communities were liberated zones, therefore both physical and mental spaces, and that, quote, transgressing such zones is one of the tasks of the African orature artist, to at least recapture some of the African rhetorical styles, such as call and response, even in the lecture format. And those of you who heard her present would see that she would deliberately do that as well. If you go to the next slide, please. She defined liberated zones as follows, and this is not this slide, but I wanted to start with this, and I'm pleased that you read the Pan-African poem, but I was deliberate about using this because for a couple of poems in that collection, which I have a copy of there on the table, she provides an introduction that this particular poem was written in an effort to liberate the concept of feminism from abduction by Western bourgeois appropriators. And then I selected this section deliberately because she was addressing the question of Palestine here. And so to be a feminist is to unhood racism, to decry Zionism, right? To detonate apartheid, to distinguish homophobia, to strangulate classism, to fumigate ethnic cleansing. I mean, how relevant is that exactly for right now? But basically what she says then, if I can go to the next, I'm not sure, but let's see. Okay. Right, and this is another version of it, to be a feminist is, and I just wanted to show a couple of pieces from her work so you can see. Oh, you can leave that now. So she says then, she defined liberated zones as follows. In the Pan-Africana world, and I was struck by the fact that she actually uses Pan-Africana deliberately in the Africana sense that you gestured to in Africana studies. The legacy of liberated zones stretches a long way back in the history of struggle against slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. Historically, and in physical terms, it refers to areas that enslaved and colonized Africans actually seized from invaders or occupational forces, either armed struggle and bloodshed or through organized sit-ins and demonstrations, either by armed struggle and bloodshed. For her then, the remapping of colonial borders via Pan-African liberated zones physically and mentally affected a dual imperative to address both capitalist economic paradigms and Euro-colonial educational imperatives. Micere affected this in the use of oral rhetorical styles in her Pan-African politics and in her feminist articulations. Like several of the Africanist activist women she admired, she rejected being consigned to one ideological frame of reference and instead multiply articulated a range of positions, finding example in several Pan-African, in its global sense, actors who preceded us. Listen to one of her assertions from that same lecture. The question that I therefore wish to pose is, are our minds liberated zones or occupied territories? What new paradigms and theories are we as African intellectuals coming up with that can sit at the international conference tables as viable alternatives to imperialist and Western imposed models? I posit that our minds need to become the primary, quote-unquote, liberated zones we should aim at securing. Otherwise, we will not have the ability or the imagination to create viable literal ones. Okay? So, those of you who read and who you at Young is Decolonizing the Mind would see that this is a similar articulation coming from her, and I hope to link this by the end of this talk. So this is where her creative theoretical approach, a concept I developed along with graduate students at Binghamton and Cornell universities, to address the way some artists are able to advance theoretical arguments and positions in a creative way. I want to assert here, though, that her creative theoretical methodology involved as a scholar and as a poet the following. 1, developing the theoretical arguments and then presenting them orally in a form that used the creative models from Orature. This is what she did in her praxis. 2, developing fully articulated essays, as she did in her collection of essays, such as Writing and Speaking from the Heart of the Mind. 3, using the poetic tradition, as we saw earlier, to sometimes articulate theoretical positions. So I'm seeing her doing 3 different versions of the creative theoretical. So first, the theoretical Micere Mugo. A generation of scholars who preceded mine advanced the simultaneity of oppressions analysis to examine how oppressive systems of African and European patriarchy, capitalism, and classism combined to erase women from leadership. They included people like Mularo Golipe, Amataidu, Wangui, and Micere Mugo. They all asserted a combined care for the next generation of scholarship, as was evident in their love for imparting knowledge to students, activism, and definitely in their writing. Sometimes a more frontal approach was needed, as in Edu's So What If I'm a Feminist? And you all have seen that interview she did with Sanina in London, right? And Google it anytime you have a chance, where she asked us, so are you trying to say that you're claiming feminism? And she's like, yeah, so what if I'm a feminist? It's an ideology, she kept saying over and over again. It's an ideology like Marxism or any of the others. So what if I'm a feminist? I'm a feminist. Feminism then is an ideology like any other. So this generation advanced feminism as an ideology for sure that could be modified, redefined contextually, culturally, and geographically to guide practice that challenge attempts to erase Black African women from full participation in their society's leadership structures. And this is why I have the Women's Charter up there. Because I was arguing at another conference, actually this past weekend, Global Visions of Freedom Conference at Brown, that often people assume, and this is really important for Nicole, for you to hear this, people assume that the emphasis or the influence is coming from the US. And when I started as a young scholar, we would get this all the time. I'm sure you remember, right? A lot of the African male scholars would say, feminism, no, it has no impact on Africa. We have no need for that, and so on. So it was only with women like Micere, Ama, and the others who would have that pushback consistently, and they took a lot of blows for it, including people like Mularo and others. So essentially, what they were doing, it seems, was advancing sort of theoretical paradigms that would lead forward. So for me, I went back to this Women's Charter. This is 1954. So again, the assumption is that it comes from Kambahi River Collective and the Black Feminist Statement. But I'm suggesting, and I did in that conference at Brown, that these are mutually reinforcing paradigms. I mean, you'll see why. So because most of my recent work was on Black women's leadership across the African world, which led to the publication of my recent book, Black Women's Rights, Leadership and the Circularities of Power, I thought it important to engage in this piece how Micere had also contributed to this discussion of the role of women's leadership as intellectuals, as creative writers, and in community activism. I will highlight only a few selected sources, but let us linger on one of these. And if I can get the next slide. But I love this 1954 Women's Charter because it's already laying out some of the principles that then appear later in the African Protocol. But even in CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, would also use some of this language. If I can go to the next slide. Yes, this is the one I wanted. So years ago, when I was a graduate student at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, I bought a popular journal called Africa Woman. I was pleased to recover it last year in some files as I moved office, and looking through its pages recently found an interview featuring a photograph of a beautiful young Micere. And I'm not sure, Mumbi, if you have this, you must somewhere.
I do not, and I've seen Jerry in her.
Oh my goodness. Gorgeous. Yeah, actually, I spoke to Micere before she passed about using this interview in a collection, a handbook of Black feminisms we're working on. And she gave it permission orally. I don't know if that holds up. But I will have to come back to you then. Yeah, anyway, I was pleased to just recover it last year in some files as I moved office and looking through its pages from an interview featuring a photograph of a beautiful young Micere Mugo titled Dr. Micere Mugo, Kenya's outspoken intellectual and academic critic, talks to Nancy Owano. They are reflecting on her work with Ngugi on the trial of Dedan Kimathi in 1976. She describes women's role in the struggles as captured in the play thus, quote, "As for women in the struggle, one of the play's main characters is a woman who coordinated messages from town to forest, and she trafficked guns. For a woman played a very dangerous role in the struggle and who had been cowardly, Mugo and Owano in 1976. So basically, she's already asserting a particular gender can be read as African feminist approach, even in that representation. I'm suggesting the influences are not necessarily coming only from the US, those are mutually enforcing, but that there's a whole other genealogy that is coming from it. And of course, we have intellectual work from Dr. Chebe, which makes that case exactly. So at that time then, she was a senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi and would become, as was indicated, the first woman dean. But notice she's identified as an intellectual gadfly who had won many critics as well as supporters with her ideas on women's oppression, African socialism, and literary imperialism. But reading it today, it was gratifying to see how timely and advanced the discussions were, as she talked even then about some of the bases for African feminist politics of her generation. The still relevant simultaneity of oppression analysis, linking the need for socialist praxis as it combines with women's rights, thus already being revealed. So this is important to note, though, that Micere Mugo's identification of African women's leadership preceded contemporary scholarly articulations generated out of African diaspora experience. Over the years, she would indicate in her poetry and in her writing a long list, repeatedly, of African women, African diaspora women who have contributed to liberation struggles. And if you look at the poem Mother Africa's Matriarchs, you will see that that's what she does there. She does it elsewhere. So analysis offered a dynamic first-hand praxis presented with amazing grace and charm. And this is one of the things that many of us admired about Micere, that she would be so gracious and soft-spoken, smiling while many of us were fighting in front of me. But she did it with such grace and charm. And she would be saying very powerful critiques of positions. So she offered that consistently, a kind of self-defined vision of the future, which I would say still has not been realized. This is what she says, though, in some of these places in this interview, which I wanted to linger with a little bit. "I see a system where all oppressive institutions are dismantled, politically, socially, for the sake of men and women." There she offers a discussion in which she affirms that because of this distinct collaborative arrangement between the various oppressions, that we also need an analysis that similarly does that kind of work. That's that simultaneity of oppressions analysis that appears. This is what she says in this interview, and I checked off some of it. First, thank you. First of all, let me note that we cannot speak of women's oppression by men. In capitalist systems, women tend to be exploited by the very nature of the society, particularly the working and peasant women, just as men are exploited. The difference is that women are hit particularly hard. Their most obvious hardship is, of course, not being educated and so on. But notice she says, all of these forms of abuse, sexual abuse, wife beating, and so on, women are taking advantage of because of that role. And of course, I'm sure you have heard the discussion from Okuma recently. I won't go into that. But I won't give the impression, she says, that I foster any illusion. She says it takes place also in socialist societies in terms of how women are treated. So seeing the need then to maintain a collaborative vision for Africans as well as generated from within African cultures, this is where she gets to I am because we are the imperative Utu Ubuntu for transformational scholarship, which became the title of one of her lectures and appears in that book, Writing and Speaking from the Heart of My Mind, which is, of course, a collection of her essays. I found it, though, in some of those essays, she returns to Cabral's, Amilcar Cabral's Return to the Source. And, of course, most of you should know that short essay where he talks about the role of culture, right, in African liberation. But she offers a reinterpretation and elaboration, in which she says, the return to the source could also mean returning to women's knowledge systems, which does make sense, right? To me, returning to women's knowledge as women are the source of, of knowledge, sustenance, and creativity. And above all, if Pan-Africanism is to have any real community activity, it must come through full engagement with women. Thus, quote, the leadership of African women has been consistent through the historic role of African women as leaders, who have led as emotional resources of their communities and provided guidance in tangible ways. So she develops this really well in her chapter titled Re-envisioning Pan-Africanism, What Are the Roles of Gender, Youth, and the Masses, page 163. A committed Pan-Africanist and feminist then, she offered ways of looking at the necessity of bringing these ideological positions together for the benefit of women, for the benefit of society, and had to be effected through collaborative stances and ideological positions that typify the simultaneity of oppressions approach that is hallmark of Black feminism. So definitions of each of these philosophies are indicated really well. We can go to the next one because I'm running out of time. And this is where, from that same interview, she talks about the impact of women's roles. And I was really taken, just imagining the fact that women we see now as grandmothers, older women, however we want to term them, elders. Many of these were women who carried arms, smuggled weapons back and forth, and so on. So, you know, we have to really find sometimes how we look at elder women or old women. Sometimes they are the one most actively involved in activist work that you wouldn't even realize is taking place. But what I'm suggesting, though, and I'm using a reference from a young colleague I met not too long ago from Chiapas, Mexico, they define it as depatriarchalizing and decolonizing. And I love the fact that that's the first time I saw somebody do those two things together. So it's not just decolonizing, but also depatriarchalizing analyses, how we understand the word. So I'd like to bring that framework also into Pan-Africanist scholarship as ways of looking at the Black radical tradition. If I can get the next one. Pat McFadden, I don't know if that's there. Okay, there's another influence that she identifies in that piece, the influence of Grace Scott, an earlier African woman writer who doesn't get as much recognition as she can. One more, please. Okay, these are other references that probably are coming from that essay. I was trying to get to the Pat McFadden piece. Anyway, African women, according to Pat McFadden, Women in Action, 1997, have been important and visible part, it may be somewhere on the slide, visible part of our modern African political life. We participated in anti-colonial struggles as trade unionists, political leaders, wives, and mothers, often in more traditional ways that women have entered politics, but we have also made fundamental changes to the body politic. So this is where that link to that African Women's Charter works. But clearly, because of our ways of looking at, I'm trying to jump ahead because of the time, we assume again that the lineage comes from Combahee, but keep in mind that Combahee River Collective is first published in 1979 in Zilla Eisenstein's Capitalist Patriarchy and the Case for Socialist Feminism, and then republished in Brave in 1982. Look at the dates. And actually, this came to me in a panel with Wangui and Goro at African Studies. We'll be like, wait a minute, the dates don't really add up. So it always influences not coming largely from Black feminists in the United States and coming from somewhere else. And that somewhere else is what Pat McFadden identifies: trade union activism, work, prior work anti-apartheid, and so on. Okay? So let me sort of jump to what's the ending because I know of the time. So I've talked about all of that already. So what were her creative theoretical methodologies? And there's interesting work coming out, I should say, on the Kenyan woman and the influence of those activist women in the Mau Mau Kenyan Land and Freedom Army activities, along with the Kimathi. she indicates me Katalili, for example, as one of these important women. So what the second portion of the talk that I wanted to talk about a little bit more was what was her creative theoretical methodology. And basically what I want to suggest then is how she fits into that model. And what I want to do with this creative theoretical work is really identify her deliberately as one of those people who would be doing that kind of work. So Sylvia Winter calls our species, human species, a storytelling species, Humonarans, she calls them, alternatively indicated by her as the science of the word. So the creative impetus becomes driver to its theoretical complexity in the Winter case, beginning with the creative dance, theater, playwriting, and so on, and ending with a deliberate range of theoretical positions in her more complex essays, more directly on the question of the human. But also finding within cultural traditions we experience a framework for analysis or intelligibility, which in some cultural contexts are communicated succinctly and repeatedly as a normative. And in Black Women Writing and Identity, Migrations of the Subject, I talk about how we could think of some of these models, how we engage theoretical positions as visitors to our communities. So the examples I gave was how one engages a visitor in Black culture. You follow them to the door, to the gate, or you walk down the street with them, you walk back. And I was even suggesting that in some urban Black cultural contexts, you don't even open the door. Right? You look like, no middle speak today kind of thing. So also the parallel creative and theoretical assertions of Toni Morrison would be a good example. The stories of Amatadu would be similarly one way of thinking through this. But for Micere, the parallel intellectual and creative play is advanced separately as Toni Morrison does, because you're talking about a scholar, as I'm sure we heard Dr. West will also talk about. So she is advancing it both as a scholar and as a creative person. She's doing the two at the same time simultaneously. Toni Morrison is writing all these novels. She is doing it through poetry and her orature presentations and so on. So her collection of poems then, My Mother's Poem and Other Songs, is for me one of the best sources for understanding how she does this creative theoretical work. And that series of 4 poems that we showed earlier, if I can go maybe to the next slide, let me see what that is. It's hard when you're not doing it yourself. Yeah, and if we can think through what she's doing in that collection of poems, that's fine, we can leave that out. Mother Africa's Matriarchs, for example, is deliberate about finding new language, and she's deliberately using matriarch instead of patriarch, because she's saying that, again, depatriarchalizing the language. So she sees then in that introduction a contribution towards the urgent task of engendering Pan-Africanism, our historical memories, our language and concepts such as patriotism, right? This poem then is in its entirety after a series of lines which are determined to offer praise for African patriots and matriarchs. It devotes a paragraph to Black women worldwide, from Nefertiti to Harriet Tubman, who have led and participated in more movements all over the world. And you see her doing the same thing in that collection, in that poem titled To Be a Feminist. But for conclusion, therefore, if academic symposia are where we place scholars in the canon, then we want to ensure, hopefully by the end of this symposium, that we identify very deliberately that Micere Mugo belongs also to the Black radical intellectual tradition. In Sisters Outside the Black radical intellectual tradition, I challenged that formation, advanced really wonderfully by Cedric Robinson, but as leaving women out consistently. And those of you who know that collection will know he uses James, Richard Wright, and Celia Adamson, and really doesn't ever get to talking about women. Many of them were writing at that same time or had written before. So in that process then of decolonizing and depatriarchalizing our knowledge production in African literary studies, definitely in Pan-Africanism, definitely in Black feminism, I want to assert by these means that Micere Mugo, to me, enters all of these traditions solidly. And I would want to declare that going forward, we want to assert that she is really strongly to be represented in each of those 3 traditions: Black feminism, Pan-Africanism, and Black radical tradition in general. Thank you so much.
Thank you. so much. The wonderful presentation, Dr. Boyce-Davies. Next we will have Dr. Michael West, Professor of Africana, African American Studies, History, and African Studies, Department of African Studies. He's at the Department of African American Studies at Penn State University. Dr. West has published broadly in the fields of Southern African history, Pan-Africanism, African Studies, African Diaspora Studies, and African American Studies, including 3 authored and edited books and more than 50 articles in academic journals. His current research centers on the Black Power movement and global perspectives, including the book Project on Kwame Nkrumah and Black Power. Welcome, Dr. West.
Thank you, Hamilton-Wray.
Yes.
I want to thank the organizers of this forum, the department, the program in African Studies, Professor Leah Zulu, Professor Brown, Nicole Brown. Thank you also for inviting me. It's wonderful to see Monde. Mr. Monde, welcome. Thank you for coming. My subject is Lifting the Curtain, Micere Mugo and African Vindication. Now, vindication, it is an oft-used word in the writings of African-descended folk. I want to thank Professor Carole Boyce-Davies for that wonderful historical archaeology and ideological placement of our dear sister. That was really wonderful and beautiful. So this word vindication is an often used one in the writings and intellectual productions of African-descended folk from the 18th to the 20th centuries, most commonly, though by no means exclusively, in the United States of America. The story of the vindicationist tradition is well summarized by the U.S. African-American Pan-Africanist scholar and self-professed vindicationist St. Clair Drake in his very masterful 2-volume work, Black Folk Here and There. This tradition, Drake notes, involves a critique of, and I quote him here, Darwinian evolutionists who sought to prove that black people were closest to the ape, and of Darwinian and social Darwinists who insisted that Negroes were doomed to disappear in the struggle for existence against superior Aryans, Nordics, and African Hamites, end of quotation. It was and remains a daunting task, the struggle to defend black humanity against the indignities and insults hurled by their oppressors and the intellectual enablers of the oppressors. In sum, the black vindication tradition is a struggle against erudition in the service of exploitation. And erudition in the service of exploitation has rarely been better summarized than it was by Lydia Maria Child, a U.S. white anti-slavery crusader, in her 1833 text, an appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans. Highlighting the resistance of enslaved people, Child asserted that captives brought from Africa have, and I quote her, have starved themselves for freedom, jumped into the waves for freedom, starved for freedom, fought like very tigers for freedom, but they have been hung and burned and shot, and their tyrants have been their historians. Their tyrants have been their historians. This fundamentally is the reason for the emergence of the vindicationist tradition. The tyrants of black folk historically have doubled as their historians. This was certainly what caused David Walker in his 1829 pamphlet, An Appeal to Colored Citizens of the World, a text that did the groundwork for Charles' book, including inspiring its title, to set out on an odyssey of what Walker called troubling the pages of historians. Walker's research determined that the enslavement and abasement of Africans and their offspring were a consequence of what he termed white Christian avariciousness, what nowadays is sometimes called racial capitalism. Walker and Charles subsequently would, as Charles subsequently would, concluded that the problem extended to erudition in the service of exploitation. In other language, the tyrants of the blacks were also their historians. Hence the importance of the Vindication tradition, then and now, which is where Micere Mugo, of blessed memory, enters. Sister Mugo's biographer is here, and I certainly would not be so presumptuous as to attempt to preempt him, a task at which I would fail anyhow. It is sufficient to say, though, that Micere was spiritually and politically, at least spiritually and politically, an offspring of the most consequential anti-colonial, one of the most consequential anti-colonial revolts in post-World War II Africa. This was the movement his progenitors called the Land and Freedom Army, the mission of which is already stated in the name of the movement, but which the colonial authorities in their transliteration rendered as Mama, which is to say something wild, irrational, insane, since in the colonial imagination one had to be mentally ill to reject the reputed civilizing mission of colonialism. Also, the same child of insanity had been hurled at those who overtly resisted slavery on this side of the Atlantic, whether by physically fleeing from it, as in running away, becoming a maroon, or by militarily confronting it, as in revolting in the matter of the Land and Freedom Army. And so Micere Mugo had made her choice. As a denizen of a neo-colonial society, as Kenya surely became after independence, she could have lived a comfortable life, I should say, a comfortable life of an ivory tower academic, even if likely that life would not have amounted to living the life of a millionaire, as the great Nina Simone had put it in song, even if not in life. But just as Nina had made the journey from supper club songstress to musician of the movement, so too Micere had made her choice. A laborer in the vineyard of literature and orature, she would place her talent, and a considerable talent it was, in the service of the struggle of the producing classes. Not in the service of the procuring classes. That would have been another choice, one that may well have afforded her that millionaire's lifestyle, but in the struggle of the producing classes, which is to say the working people. It was a choice for which, of course, as we've already been told, she paid a high price, including persecution, JLN, and exile. But she had made her choice, not just for herself, but also for her daughters, Mombe and Jere, of blessed memory. That was how she ended up in exile. They ended up in exile, first in Zimbabwe, and then in these United States of America. My first engagement with, my first substantive engagement, I should say, with Micere happened some 30 years ago this month, in April 1994. The event was a conference at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, an event I had a hand in organizing. I should note that two individuals, in some ways, this meeting is serving as a reunion, because both Carole, Boyce-Davies and Horace Campbell were at this meeting 30 years ago. I'm not trying to date them, of course, on myself. Now, tragically, this meeting coincided with breaking news of the Rwanda genocide 30 years ago. A striking scene at the Illinois conference was Micere's confronting of the Congolese philosopher Valentin Mudimbi, Mudimbe was a well-regarded personage, and he should still be alive. Well-regarded personage in African studies, but given to speaking in rather obscure English language. And some claim that, as if they were interpreters of tongues, to be able to decipher his obscurantism. But Micere Mugo was not among those so claiming. No sooner had Mudimbe concluded his spiel than Micere was on her feet, fingers pointing, demanding to know in plain language what the good professor had just said. Visibly shaking Mudimbe could only offer lamely that he had been engaged in a meditation as if he was still a member of the priesthood to which he once belonged.
Oh my goodness.
Now, this dressing down of Professor Mudimbe would prove to be something of dress rehearsal. Next came the so-called curtain affair. Should be well known, of course, to students of African studies in the United States and beyond. The curtain in question was Philip D. Curtin, then considered the leading historian of Africa in the United States. Curtin had earned his Africanist spurs as an authority on the Atlantic slave trade. His 1969 census on the slave trade had, he claimed, replaced flimsy, his own language, flimsy, unsubstantial guesswork with hard data, some of that guesswork having been the handiwork of that notorious vindicationist one W.E.B. Du Bois. Curtin had also led the study of the slave trade into a cul-de-sac where it remained for some time centered at head counting and a numbers game instead of more fundamental and substantive questions about the impact of the slave trade on African peoples globally, questions like development and underdevelopment, which Walter Rodney would take up in his great work of 1972, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And then out of the blue, Professor Curtin published an essay on the 3rd of March 1995 in the issue of the Chronicle of Higher Education, a leading academic journal in the United States, read religiously by the captains of the academy, deans and provosts and presidents and such personages. Professor Curtin's essay came with a rather startling title. It was called Ghettoizing African History. In it, he asserted that African history was being turned into, quote him here, an enclave within the university set aside for black scholars. The result, Professor Curtin went on, was his own language, intellectual apartheid. Imagine that, intellectual apartheid. Black folk guilty of practicing and benefit from intellectual apartheid. Accordingly, Professor Curtin went on, there was a decline in standards, reduction in the quality of work, because what he calls so many white graduate students have been pushed out of the field of African studies. This, of course, was done in truth and fact on their head. Even as he wrote, Professor Curtin and his students, all overwhelmingly white and male, remained the dominant players in African historical studies in the United States. They held the major professorships in the major universities, edited the major journals and book series in the field of African studies and African history generally, dominated the bodies that handed out the major fellowships in African studies and African history, and served as key assessors for tenure and promotion in African history and African studies. Curtin, in other language, had turned Lydia Maria Child on her head. The reputed leading historian of Africa had now become the leading tyrant of black historians of Africa. So black historians of Africa were rather taken aback, and they in fact were aghast. Professor Curtin was at his numbers game again, this time counting or rather miscounting black historians of Africa as he had previously miscounted the victims of the Atlantic slave trade. Privately, there was a howl of protest among black historians of Africa, and that howl was virtually unanimous. Eventually, some 50 of those black historians, some of them kicking and screaming about fear of victimization by what they called Curtin and his boys, which was how the powerful coterie was referred to, were persuaded to sign a letter repudiating Curtin's claims. But then what? Now, rather surprisingly, Professor Curtin accepted an invitation to defend his views at the next annual meeting of the African Studies Association. Yet this opportunity seemingly created a dilemma. Who was going to speak for the black historians?
None of them came.
None of them. No senior black historian of Africa could be found to engage in a debate with Professor Curtin, not one. The senior black historians stopped answering their phones and responding to faxes, which was how we communicated with those days before the prevalence of emails. And one I want to point out, not exactly in their defense, that their fears were not altogether unfounded. Curtin and his boys were not known to play nice in the sandbox with critics. But then again, neither were the neo-colonial rulers of Kenya, who, unlike Curtin and his boys, had a police force and a carceral system at their disposal. They disposed of real force, not merely of the intellectual and professional soul. And this is where Micere Mugo entered the picture. The scholar of Orature would now become the defender of the historians of Africa. She had come face to face with tyrants before, those capable of snuffing out life, not just professionally, but also physically. And so Curtin and her boys did not scare her. Like the Maroons and the enslaved revolutionists of old, like the fighters of the Land and Freedom Army, Micere was crazy enough to confront injustice head on. She had, in other language, the courage of her conviction. The bravura defense of African-descended scholars in African history and African studies generally has long been remembered and will be remembered for a long time to come, I would say. Hers was a dazzling and spellbinding performance of African vindication. I want to end my offering here this morning by quoting some lines from her address. She said, and I quote, "My intervention seeks to dislodge some of the missiles directed by Professor Curtin at scholars of African origin in the United States. Some might wonder, what does a non-historian have to do with this whole debate?" Now she is she's speaking in, before about 1,000 people or so. The entire African Studies assembly had turned out. It was in a huge hall, standing room. I'm sure the fire marshals would have condemned the whole place had they turned up. But the entire, everyone at the conference, 1,100 people, all present for the showdown. And so Micere continued, then how, some might wonder what non-historian has to do with this debate. The answer is obvious. Even though the substance of the said article references historians, what Professor Curtin says is relevant to all scholars of African origin and beyond, irrespective of their academic disciplines. The simplest of reasons is that the stench of Professor Curtin's imagined ghetto that Africana historians are supposedly created in the United States is hitting all our noses is going to hit all our noses at some point. You know how easily ghettos and their attendant problems sprawl. It's clear that academicians are part and parcel of the larger world of contradictions around their campuses. Voluntarily or involuntarily, they are either advocates of false consciousness manifested through backward nationalism, chauvinism, racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, and so on, or alternatively, agents of liberating consciousness affirming the humanity of us all. And then Micere standing at the podium, turned directly to Professor Curtin and said in her concluding lines, "Professor Curtin, yourself and myself are," and she did so with all the flame and drama with which she was capable of, which was a good deal. And she said, "Professor Curtin, yourself and myself are all part and parcel of this historical process. There is no drawing a curtain," that is C-U-R-T-A-I-N, "there is no drawing a curtain around the challenge." And then she continued. That was it. Thus was the veil of intellectual tyranny lifted and the Africanist emperor unmasked. Word was that we had mobilized the Land and Freedom Army and sick Mau Mau on Curtin and his boys. Yeah. That was Micere Mugo, now gone on to glory, Micere Mugo of partisan of human liberation and African vindication. Thank you.
Let us continue with Dr. Horace G. Campbell, Professor of African American Studies and Political Science, Director of the African Initiative at Syracuse University. Dr. Campbell is an internationally known peace and justice activist. He holds a joint professorship in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Political Science at Syracuse University. Dr. Campbell has published widely. His most recent book is Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya, Lessons for Africa and the Forging of African Unity. His most well-known book, he is also the author of Reclaiming Zimbabwe, The Exhaustion of the Patriarchal Model of Liberation. He has published more than 100 journal articles and a dozen monographs, as well as chapters in edited books. He serves as chairperson of the Global Pan-African Movement, North American Delegation. Welcome, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you all for here this morning for this symposium on our departed sister who's left us physically, but as you could hear from what the two presenters before me stated, she is gone physically, but the power of her work resides with us and remains with us. I want to again join in thanking the NSU and thanking the African Studies, African and African American Studies, and thanking the family of scholars and intellectuals who have come here. And I want to thank all of those who continue in this work. And I want to salute those who want to ensure that Micere's scholarship and legacy endures. Micere's work, the biographer, as Michael said, is here, and he has the book. You should hold it up so everybody can see it, that we want everybody to get a hold of, because this book contains very significant writings over the past 50 years of Micere, and it really brings together a lot of the scholarship and people who worked with her. Mumbi has the difficult task of being a daughter and an archivist at the same time in this moment, because their work is global in different parts of the world, because Micere was a global person. But she was firmly rooted in the community in Syracuse. And the last time we met collectively with Micere was only 3 weeks before she joined the Ancestors. We had a meeting of the Pan-African community of Central New York on the 12th of June. And Micere, you could see she was struggling. Micere departed on the 30th of June. But all throughout her struggles with what she called the monster, she kept the community informed, so that health and the question of health and wellness were not private matters. It was a matter that she should be communicating with her constituency, with the people she lived and worked with. And so, as we are continuing to fight with that monster in all of our lives, in all of our communities, and how this monster is affecting us, and we see this in how they're trying to change Syracuse without black people at the present moment. There's a plan for $50 billion worth of investment in Syracuse. It's something called Micron for semiconductors, to move the semiconductor industry from Taiwan to upstate New York because of the planned confrontation with China. And so we have the displacement of Africans and African peoples and indigenous peoples at the same time where there's this massive investment in what they call new technologies. So that's where we are in terms of how do we survive, and what Micere inspired us to be, as she's always talked about, is what it is to be human and what kind of human. So I want to talk about Micere in the context of grassroots Pan-Africanism and progressive Pan-African feminism. Because in 2024, we have this specter haunting humanity about what kind of human beings are we going to be. This is a specter of Micron in Syracuse. This is a specter that we see in robotics, genetic engineering, and now research into artificial intelligence. We heard from Stephen Hawkins, who said that the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. What does that mean for us as human beings? What does it mean to be a human being? And why is Utu and being humans so important? Some people now are talking about the dangers of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the powerful AI systems should be developed only once we are confident that their ethics will be positive and their risks will be manageable. This is what major scientists are saying. Well, global Africans welcome this concern for humanity, and we will be engaged in pushing for the conception of a human being that transcends the capitalist and eugenic conceptions of humanity. Capitalism for the past 400 years was a social system, is a social system that is based on dehumanization. The system of enslavement treated Africans as robots to produce wealth. The Pan-African movement of yesterday organized against that form of robotics, just as the contemporary Pan-Africanist movement are engaged in the struggle for human emancipation. The prospects of Pan-African liberation and solidarity are linked to the humanization of the planet and the affirmation of dignity. Micere was always fighting for living with dignity. Micere died with dignity, and she wants us to understand what it means to struggle to be a dignified human being. These prospects of being a dignified human being are all linked up to what the Pan-African Project was all about. The Pan-African Project has always been about dignity. The first Pan-Africanists were opposed to the robotics of yesterday, when the forms of enslavement of the plantations in the Americans treated Africans like robots to produce wealth. Some of you are familiar with the work of Ed Baptiste, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. He documented that phase of dehumanization. And that dehumanization talked about how the availability of cheap labor and the shortage of labor led to ruthless system of exploitation. Talk about the internal slave trade and the kind of couples and what that meant. That enslaved people called the pushing system. And Baptiste says that this was a technology that was called the innovation in violence. It was a vibrant Pan-Africanism of the grassroots that precipitated the rebellions against that form of robotization. Bonds had been forged on the slave ships where the first Pan-Africanists were to be found, where the conception of freedom transcended the individual, transcended the ethnic group, and the consciousness that no black person can be free until all Africa is free. No black person can be free while opposing and oppressing other human beings. Herein lay the origins of the Pan-African movement. Harriet Tubman was not intimidated by the technological advance of the railroad, of iron and steel, and she worked and perfected the alternative railroad for freedom. Human beings at that time were not afraid of the development of the wireless technology of this time. The quilt became the communication skill and the communication tool for black people at that particular moment. So at all periods, black people, Pan-African people, global African people were conscious about organizing to emancipate themselves. But in the process of intellectuals getting involved in this project called Pan-African Liberation, we've had many different renditions of Pan-Africanism. And in the academy, where people seeks to professionalize Pan-Africanism, we have the liberal Pan-Africanist that talks about equality within the capitalist system. But Micere Mugo understood that we cannot have equality under capitalism. So she was opposed to liberal Pan-Africanism, just as she was opposed to liberal feminism. And Carole Boyce-Davies has already brought attention to her work in this area. And she quoted from Micere Mugo's intervention in steering the contribution of the Pan-African movement of the laboring peoples to shift the field of discussion from great men and great leaders. Pan-Africanism, as in the words of Micere Mugo, comes from the lived experiences of the people, though not cited in intellectual discourses that have to come in the literary canon on Pan-Africanism, in their activism as well as participation. Women were and have always been the heart of Pan-Africanist essence, if you like, substance. My point is Pan-Africanism may be seen as manifest based in itself in two ways, which are equally important to the movement itself, through the lived aspects. As a movement, Pan-Africanism is characterized by fluctuations, registering bouts of life and dominant loss. On the other hand, the lived aspects, actual substance, essence, have always remained the persistent over historical time. Ordinary people of the masses, including the majority of Africana women, have been the keepers of carriers of the essence of this movement. I think that when we talk about Pan-Africanism today, this intervention that Micere made, that came out of the discussion at this time, both in teaching and learning, both in her activism and her scholarship as a writer, as an artist. We saw how she ensured that the concept of Pan-Africanism as a movement, as an idea, must be linked to the ordinary people. Micere Mugo came from Kenya. Kenya is a society where, as Michael West talked about, the Land and Freedom Army was one of the highest expression of Pan-Africanism. Mm-hmm. The leader of Kenya at that time was someone called Jomo Kenyatta, and we can tell stories about Jomo Kenyatta. But the very same leadership of Jomo Kenyatta, who participated in the Pan-African movement of the 1930s and 40s, was also silencing people in Kenya when they wanted to talk about Pan-Africanism. And that is the kind of culture Micere Mugo was reeling against. And so she drew from Walter Rodney to say Pan-Africanism must be based on a particular class, as Walter Rodney wrote in his statement towards the 6th Pan-African Congress. Which class will lead the Pan-African movement? And what are the silent classes on which this class is speaking? And Walter Rodney said at that time, in trying to rise above the politicization of ethnicity, the politicization of regionalism, the politicization of religion, Walter Rodney said, one of the cardinal principles of Pan-Africanism is that the people of one part of Africa are responsible for the freedom of their brothers and sisters in other parts of Africa, and indeed black people everywhere were to accept the same responsibility. This is the essence of the Pan-Africanism that came out of the movement that Micere Mugo matured into. Micere Mugo, as we said, was being trained. She went to the best colonial schools that were in Kenya because she was being trained to be of service to the colonial system. But very soon, as she developed as a human being, looking in the communities around her, she was saying that the ordinary people and the masses, the majority of Africana women, must be the keepers and carriers of these assets. And Walter Rodney says that labor must be the conceptual framework for which we study Pan-Africanism. Micere translated that in her own life by saying, here it is, the historians, and Michael has just talked about the historians of tyrants of empire. The historians were using the historical narrative of their bringing civilization, Christianity, and commerce to Kenya. So if you wanted to know anything about Kenya, you go to the archives of Kenya. And Caroline Elkins has brought the information about those archives containing documents about their terror that they could not even open up. They created a special archive called the Hanslow Papers to hide the information. But Micere Mugo said it's not enough to only talk about opening their archives. You must open the very sounds and words of the people. And that is how Orature developed as a discipline within the African universities and within the African scholar space. How do you bring to life the experiences of the lives of the men and women who were involved in the struggle of the Land and Freedom Army? So Orature and the poems that you talked about were part of a conscious effort to educate and inspire people about how to move forward. So this is the tradition that Micere Mugo came from, and that's the tradition she has left with us. She has left with us because we have seen, as Carole Boyce-Davies said, there's a long tradition of women who have been in the Pan-African movement, who have asserted themselves and their statement. In 1945, at one of the high points of the global Pan-African movement at the 1945 conferences, and people like to talk about Pan-Africanism in terms of conferences. They talk about great men. But Pan-Africanism didn't start with conferences. Conferences where intellectuals started to speak about the Pan-African movement. And so Walter Rodney has an essay that he wrote in 1974, November, after the 6th Pan-African Congress, saying that really you can talk about these meetings, these small affairs in rooms of 10 to 15 men, and there was the ordinary day-to-day struggles of people going on in the struggle for Pan-African freedom. But we want to talk about one of those consequential meetings, the 5th Pan-African Congress in London. At the 5th Pan-African Congress in London, all the great luminaries were there. Padmore, in Manchester. The Padmore, James wasn't there. And all of these great Pan-African luminaries. But there are these children of one of the organizers. This man was one of the organizers of the 5th Pan-African Congress. His children put in an adoption agency so she could do Pan-African work. So the children wrote a book called In Search of Mr. Mackenzie. In Search of Mr. Mackenzie is the work of these children of the luminaries of the Pan-African movement who, to do his Pan-African work, separated Pan-Africanism from the family, from the home, from Pan-Africanism. And the tradition of progressive Pan-African women says you cannot deal with Pan-Africanism in the sense that you can separate health, family, and questions of masculinity, sexism, misogyny, patriarchy from the real lives of Pan-African people. This is the lesson that is presented in this book, In Search of Mr. Mackenzie. So when we read about the 5th Pan-African Congress, we should read about that. So Micere Mugo, as both Michael and Carole has pointed out, had made her contribution in the area of what is called Pan-African Feminism and Pan-African Womanism. And I have already said this morning about Micere Mugo as an abolitionist, as a modern abolitionist in the tradition of fighting against capitalism. But I want to move towards concluding by talking about struggles within the feminist discourse, within the feminist movement, within the feminist intellectual. Because Micere Mugo was not shy, as Michael West has brought out the confrontation of African studies in 1995. We can see this in the discussion where Micere Mugo says that African orature, oral traditions, folklore, and the verbal arts must bring together the real lives of the people, and we must speak in defending the people. It was published in Case Western Reserve, 1997, because she was saying radical feminists must raise their voice, and not for equality, but for transformation of gender relations. Transformation of the relations of capital and transformation of what it means to be a human being. So Ola Taylor's work and Patricia Hill Collins' work and Micere Mugo's work has informed what progressive Pan-African feminism must be. And we cannot, as feminists, as people opposing patriarchy, opposing homophobia, talk about self-determination as self-determination for individuals. In the present moment, when we talk about our struggles against homophobia, we have in Ghana, they're just putting through what they call an anti-homosexual bill. We have in Uganda, anti-homosexual bill. We have in Zimbabwe, anti-homosexual legislation. And we have people who present themselves as Christians, tied to the white Christian nationalists in this country, who are pushing forward this kind of homophobia. Now our brothers and sisters who are in the gay and lesbian movement, who are fighting patriarchy and fighting capitalism, must raise their voices, because some time ago some of them raised their voices and said, we're afraid of being called imperialists. No, you cannot be afraid of being called imperialists. You must raise your voices, and we must teach our students that they cannot go around and talk about killing homosexuals at this particular moment in history. Let me end by talking about the waves of liberation that we are in and what is threatening us at the present moment. In the state of Michigan, you're faced with two major challenges in the state of Michigan: electric vehicles and artificial intelligence. Electric vehicles will decimate communities in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Tennessee, Alabama, and South Carolina. How are we preparing our students for these changes in the organic composition of capital? How are we all preparing our students for the robotization and brain hacking that is being carried out through artificial intelligence? How can we organize and inspire our students so that the cognitive skills of Africans, the cognitive analytical skills of African peoples that came out of African history can be used as a tool to be able to combat brain hacking at this moment? These are some of the challenges before us. And I want to conclude by talking about Micere Mugo as a human being. As a human being living with dignity and struggling for dignity. Maya Angelou, who went through many of the same things Micere Mugo went through, said, "I'm human, and nothing human is alien to me." Micere Mugo fought to be a human, and she inspired us to continue to be struggling to be better human beings. Thank you.
Welcome to Michigan, virtually.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I'm going to do a brief introduction.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Goro is a professor of translation practice and visiting academic, King's College in London, UK. Dr. Goro is an interdisciplinary, intersectional scholar and public intellectual. She is mentioned she is professor of translation and at SOAS and visiting professor. She's an acclaimed translator, writer, poet, editor, and cultural curator, working across scholarship and service in fiction, nonfiction, translation, criticism, and review. Her work has been recognized with honorary professorships, fellowships, awards, and global engagement. Best known for her groundbreaking translation of Wangui, Matigari from Kikuyu, and Veronica Tajo's As the Crow Flies from French. She co-edited the seminal text, still in wide circulation, Global Feminist Politics, Identities in Changing World with Suku Ali and Kelly Coate, Wangui's life and commitment to safeguarding and developing African languages, world literatures, and heritages by promoting intersectional freedom and translation. She is inspired by the likes of Wangari Maathai and Micere Mugo. She pioneered translation practice and studies, scholarship, and social cultural engagement, leadership, and service, supporting several institutions. These include the Translation Caucus of African Literature Association, which she founded 24 years ago. She has been curating the highly popular Translation Masterclass and Africa in Translation series through SIDESI, now in its 34th year. Welcome.
First of all, I'd like to thank the faculty and the university for this singular honor of inviting me to this amazing conference, and to also thank you for enabling me to participate online. I'm very sorry not to be with you all. I had an accident, a slight accident, which means that I'm unable to travel, and I would have loved to be with all of you, and I'm honored to be in this panel with these distinguished friends and scholars with whom I've had the fortune of engagement for many years, and thank you for the privilege. Much has been said of what I would have liked to say, and I will speak off the cuff and see if I can try and capture some of what I would like to say and some of what has been said. I was hoping to hear Carole on languages, and that is why I'm shifting my focus, because I'm a translator and my work is on languages. Hello, Carole. Hello, everyone. And I thought that maybe we should speak a little bit about Micere's work on Orature and how my work came into being. I am Kenyan, living also in the diaspora because of those conditions which led Professor Micere Mugo to live outside Kenya. And as was said rightly, we are global citizens and we are enriched by the experience, although we miss being part of our own communities of birth, but we're happy to be embraced by global communities, particularly the global, transnational, and African communities worldwide. It's given us a bigger home. I knew of Micere Mugo's work when I was 10 years old, because they started the decolonizing process at the University of Nairobi in the 70s when I was still in primary school. And in Kenya in the 70s, the University of Nairobi and the scholars there managed to change the Kenyan curriculum. So I'm one of the early products of a decolonizing curriculum where we were enabled from an early age to read African literatures. And it was a very big shift, because I personally went to a school that had European in its name. And I can tell you its name because it may be of significance. And most of the schools then, at the cusp of independence, were European, and they became mixed. And the early years is when I went to school. So my school was called Moderator European Primary School. And I was among the first Black students to go to that school. And the school hadn't quite figured out the decolonial process, so we were still reading a very English curriculum based on London and European ideas, Lorna Doone, Black Horse, and all kinds of things, which were very far, and reading about poetry about daffodils. So it was a very far cry from what would happen after that. And it was a seminal poem by Professor Micere Mugo, I Took My Child by the Hand, that and other poems like that, which were coming out of the African and local experience, as has been described, that described our reality that we were seeing, and rather than things that London Bridge and things which were so far away from us, and which were creating a kind of disconnected desire of belonging to somewhere which was not ours. And we also knew about the decolonial process of independence, the Pan-African movement that was discussed. And those big discussions were happening in the early years with Nkrumah, the early Haile Selassie, Kenyatta, and so on. So we were part of that first generation to be hearing those ideas. So we were very fired up and excited. And I was talking to somebody about this first 10 years of Kenya's independence. We were those babies who were hearing these fresh ideas. So we were fired up from an early age, thankfully. And that's how my first encounter with Micere was so groundbreaking. I also had seen her physically when she was a young scholar then, and she was extremely beautiful. And I talk about these personal things because they do matter in terms of visibility, how Black people are perceived, who's heard, who can be heard. And she was very humble about her gifts. Micere was very intelligent and talented and gifted person that I also believe, and I've been thinking about it in preparing this paper, what motivated her, because many other Kenyan women and girls did not become like Micere. There was something magical and unique about her sharpness from the beginning. She took to task teachers who were punishing students at Alliance School when nobody would have dared, just as we have heard the curtain story, that she would challenge. And with clear terms, she understood what she was saying and she could back it up. And that was very unique. So one of the people who inspired me, and I didn't realize she was my tutor, personal private tutor, because I wasn't doing very well in literature. It turns out that she was Micere's student, both at Alliance High School and also at the University of Nairobi. So I didn't know how I became a Micereist until she spoke up after Micere had passed away, and she said I was actually Micere's student. So that was passed to me in my village community by this kind member of my family who took it upon herself to help me with literature. And I was very thankful for Micere for that. But on the language question and on the Uchu question, these are things that are embedded in Kikuyu culture. Uchu is the way, the philosophy by which you deal with people with respect. And also, feminism is not so new to Kikuyu culture because the matrilineal system, and it's not about power, they were just recognized systems of lineality that are part and parcel, both of the mythical beginnings of Kikuyu culture, but also the lived historical culture, that they're still there. For example, my name is within the mythical system of the 9 daughters of Mombi, and I would like on that point to recognize Mombi and our ancestor Micere, and also her sister Jerry Coe. And thank you for all the hard work that you've done, Mombi, in memorializing your mom and going forward. So those things come from that culture from which Mombi and I derive, but Micere could also see the wider Kenyan context, which is made up of 47 communities of different languages who are always pitted against each other on divide and rule basis. And she was very careful throughout her life not to locate herself in any of those spaces in an essentialist way. She always affirmed her name and where she came from. She said, I'm from Baricho, I'm from Kirinyaga. And just to mention that Kirinyaga is very close to this famous mountain, Kenya. So she would be seeing it and she knew its power. If you're a Kikuyu person, you know that that is the claimed source of our origin. And so already within our own systems of knowledge and knowing, there was already a confidence in our identity and who we are. And that's true of all African people, including African people who were forcefully removed because our histories have remained in the oral tradition. A lot I heard about hair during the escape. The women would use the cornrow braids for escape routes. So the discourses are not lost even after all these centuries of departure. But we are removed from that education system because we were asked to relinquish our languages, which are dying at this point in time. And part of my work has come as an inspiration from Micere's recovery of Orature. And I applied this Orature to the work that I'm doing on something that I've called Traductio. And I don't want to talk too much about myself today, but that work emanated directly from the concept of Orature and the fact that we think Black, we think African, and it's not written or spoken. We paint Black, we do music Black, but those things are not taught, but somehow we know them. And I was reading about the grave sites of people who died during the period of removal, and they planted a plant that you can identify where those graves are located still. So there were many other ways of knowing, not necessarily the written, and also contextualizing this, that the civilization of Black people, as far as we know today, holds the cradle of humanity. There are manuscripts everywhere on the continent. There are writing systems, but that's not what we are taught. So my work is to excavate those knowledges. Some are known, like the Timbuktu manuscripts, the ones in Ethiopia, and they predate BC and AD. So I think the starting point and what Micere began to unearth with this decolonial process is to move back history. When I grew up, we were taught that our history began in the 19th century, which leads me to the next point of this demystifying our history and bringing it to what is convenient. And I've seen the removal, for example, of the emblems, although we are asking, and many Black people are asking for their removal, I think their removal also obfuscates that history. And I think we should be careful as a translator in asking for their removal, but asking for them to be kept as part of the record of history so that they're not a lie is not told to us as we move forward in recovering our history, and we're at the very early stages of this scholarship. At this point, I'd like to mention that the only history course in the UK, which is being taught by Professor Hakim Adi, is under threat. And right now, of closure, and he has students at the University of Chichester. The only course, history here of Black people and racism, is not taught on the mainstream curriculum. It's like colonialism and all those things never happened. And that is the danger of what will happen after that annihilation of that history. We don't exist, and we may not continue to exist. And I don't want to sound a doomsday, but I'm hearing those conversations and closures in other locations, including in Africa itself, where these things are not really taught. So one of the dangers about this language and traducture conundrum is that there are also moves to return to some imaginary African past, which can also be delimiting of the kinds of progress that Professor Micere was seeking, this Utu, but a progressive Utu, a progressive Pan-African feminism, and a Pan-Africanism that is linked with the people's, not just struggles, but who they become. And this whole idea of the aesthetics of knowledge and the lived experience of knowledge and of being, this Utu, and she called it Ubuntu, Utu Ubuntu, because in South Africa and other parts, they refer to it as Ubuntu, but it is the same philosophical as a human-centered philosophy, whether it's a child or an old person, that they must be treated with dignity and care. So we are at the risk of losing that to retrogressive African knowledges and traditions, which I think Professor Campbell described, and it is easy to turn the clock even within our culture. So we are lost in the European languages, and we are lost in our African languages and traditions. And it is, our African languages are really threatened. Uma Katrina is in her 90s, she's in her 80s, and she's the last speaker of the San language in South Africa. And she tried to create some knowledge on it, but once she dies, all the knowledge of that language will more or less go with her. And she comes from the southern part of Africa, where there's a rich flora and fauna, one of the richest ecosystems in the world, and the longest living DNA of humanity known, of the Khoisan people. And I'm saying this as part of this recovery process, that if we don't safeguard our languages, and if we don't safeguard our presence in the other languages, which we've developed and evolved to be meaningful to us, we will be lost. We will be floating somewhere in a place which is, and that's a mainstream. We're just a rare collection of people who come to gatherings such as this. So I think mainstreaming, translation in a deeper sense, and sense-making, and creating cultures out of what we already know, of humaning knowledge, is what my own work is about, and it's drawn from Orature. And many people in Africa, and many scholars, we don't know them, yet they've been writing a lot of work. The work is not valorized. External scholars, usually from Europe, and sometimes from America, who are heavily cited. The archives of the African scholars, as I see them, are decaying. They're not collected and there's wonderful research going on in Africa. And it's how we unite these knowledges, as Micere herself embodied. I would like at this point to acknowledge Washanga Dirangu's work. And we're very thankful that he was able to have that wonderful time and to interview Micere Mugo. And I like the wonderful film where Micere Mugo describes herself. And I believe it's on YouTube, but I would hope that that people will see that she didn't put herself in any box, and she wanted herself to tell people how she wanted to define herself. So I didn't want to put her in one box or another, lest I get into trouble with her spirit. And her spirit is fierce, as we have learned from this gathering today. So I think that we must, as Jacob Ross said, that in a poem, he said, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was ours to change the world as we like, in our own image." So I think Micere managed to do this with her creativity, her teaching, her performance, her political engagement, her civic and human rights work, and just in her being. And I think that this trying to live in the liberated space can have its toll on the body when the rest of the world is not working alongside with you. So I think the more people that you can encourage to be part of this movement and family is really important. I also remembered that much of the scholarly work that we have actually as Black and African feminists didn't come out of the academy, like the Kumbahi Women's Collective and people like Bell Hooks. They were publishing outside the academy. And I hope that we can encourage those voices. There are really erudite voices out there. They don't have the opportunity. Sometimes they don't have money to go to universities, but through their collectives, they're able to bring the histories, especially as Professor Campbell did mention, the older knowledges, which are also being deleted and new voices are being brought that we must purchase. And those other ones are somehow eclipsed, that I fear that these wonderful voices, like Professor Carole Boyce-Davies mentioned, of Wangui, Leslie, and Micere and Tama, that they may well be forgotten because there's this buzz, quick consumption of what are being called new writers under 40. And it's a phenomenon that I fear, because it's happening especially around Black and African women, that they will be forgotten and made into dinosaurs, while their work remains so fresh, as was said by Professor Davies, that it was done a long time ago, but it speaks to the day. And that is true of much scholarship. So we have to have that deeper conversation of really what is Africans and Black studies, and where are we going to find it in and out of the academy? Where are those places where we're going to gather consistently, which are safe, where we can explore the paths forward, that it's not a truncated one-off experience, but something which has a legacy, which is durable, which has roots, and which the future generations can continue to build upon. Because when a big baobab tree like Professor Micere and Professor Tama pass away, thankfully they have left us recorded work. But collectively, our work, it's hard still to publish. Those gatekeepers are still with us. And it's a yin and yang, but we have moments where we are able to push back, and there are other moments when we are overwhelmed. And maybe I should end with this debate on the critical race theory, because it's connected to this, that in a world that believes in the freedom of expression, especially when you call out racists, they come out very strongly in defense of the right to the freedom of expression. I have not known in all my scholarship where a theory was silenced. I have not, even when people were homophobic and they never did silence those theories. And we know we've lived through racist theories trying to argue against them, and they were valorized, and we were called to post-colonial and decolonial and everything else colonial. And we were pushing back and saying, that's not our trajectory, to be dancing around colonialism. We have other things, recovery of ourselves and our knowledge. There are other paths that we may want to follow. And I like what Professor Carole said about the posts in, she critiqued this whole post-colonialing us and fast-tracking us when we hadn't even caught up with understanding who we are, what's our time of day, as as we might say. So I think this is a very dangerous trend, and it seems to be happening universally. It's not just about critical race theory, but it's that curtain moment where this ghettoizing discourse is actually happening, that we are being pushed to margins, and we will be pushed to places where we may have to be doing this work in ways that we never imagined possible. And with that, I would like to invite us to engage critically with history, with reality, and to see the advances and dangers, and to protect what we have already gained, because those on whose shoulders we stand did very heavy lifting. And it would be such a pity if we don't take it upon ourselves as personal liberatory activity as scholars to continue doing what many Black scholars do outside their scholarship, which is to protect, safeguard, and extend these knowledge systems, and to continue working transnationally and learning from each other and seeing how much we have in common. I remember with my last minute, I will again acknowledge the work that Professor Carole Boyce-Davies did with the encyclopedia of the Black and African history, and just how much we were discovering of who really we were. We were connecting physically and in the text for the first time. And I remember this Yoruba woman hearing somebody from the I think Brazilian diaspora singing this Yoruba song. Neither of them had visited each other's countries, yet this song had survived the time, and the person from Africa could hear an earlier version of the song, and the person from Brazil didn't know what the song meant. But there was this moment where the meaning, which brings me back to the translation point, where the meaning could be heard by the Brazilian person, and the person from Africa could hear what had been lost in what had been taken and preserved in the oral tradition in another place. And I'm hearing more and more of these stories. So our work is cut out. And I hope that we can decide, as Professor Micere said, are we intellectuals or imposters? Are we intellectuals or imposters? And I'd like to just end with the last line of her poem, where she says, "You tell me this and I will tell you whether they are intellectuals or imposters. Tell me whether their theories, are active volcanoes erupting with fertilizing lava on which to plant seeds that will germinate with self-knowledge, seeds that will cross fertile into collective being, knowledge become action theory, knowledge become living testimony of our people's affirmative history, liberated her story, action theory inscribed as a protest, manifesto, realigning our people's averted humanity. Yes, tell me, and I will tell you whether they are intellectuals or imposters." I thank you.